Many people take it as sort of a one-to-one correspondence. The beast is this, or the whore of Babylon is that. But what's so compelling about the book is that these images can be read in so many different ways.
Princeton religion professor Elaine Pagels today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. There are 66 books in the Bible, but none more controversial, more discussed and studied and debated than the last one, the book of Revelation. Its author is commonly believed to be John, who is the apostle of Jesus, but even that fact has been debated and studied and discussed. The book of Revelation is filled with apocalyptic imagery and language that to some is a metaphor, to others is to be taken literally, especially in light of current geopolitical events, which you may have read about a lot lately on social media. It was her own fascination with the book of Revelation that led noted Princeton University religion professor Elaine Pagels to take on the task of putting the book of Revelation into a political and historical and spiritual context for the rest of us. The result was her 2012 book called Revelations. Now, she and I met one day early that spring to talk about it. In just a moment, our conversation.
This is one of the more than 10,000 interviews that noted radio personality Bill Thompson did over a 30-year span. Sit back and relax, unless you're driving, in which case, keep your eyes on the road.
So here now from 2012, Elaine Pagels. What inspired you, if I may use that terminology, to write this book?
Well, that's a good question, because it's a very strange book and it's a very controversial book. For one thing, a friend of mine said to me, I wish you'd write about the book of Revelation so I could understand it. And I said to him, well, first of all, nobody understands it, and I would never do that. But then I realized it's a very interesting book. It's one of the most popular books in the Christian canon. People love it or they hate it. And I realized it could tell us a lot about religion and how it impacts people. And that's what I was thinking about at the time.
Also, it's epic movie-like nature appeals to people who have no faith whatsoever.
Yes, and it appeals to artists. Incredible art from William Blake and Michelangelo to Bosch, because this book consists basically of visions. It's graphic images which are very wild and strange and very compelling.
And unlike the rest of the Bible, which largely is history, this is forward-looking.
Many people have read it as predictive. It's certainly prophetic, and it says that it's about what's going to happen in the future. So yes, in that sense, it's predictive. But what's been interesting is that many people, especially American Christians, take it as sort of a one-to-one correspondence, like the beast is this, or the whore of Babylon is that. And of course, this has happened for 2,000 years. But what's so compelling about the book is that these images, however vivid they are, and they're wild and vivid, they're the stuff of nightmares, can be read in so many different ways.
I actually had a friend in 1979 who was convinced, as the 1980 presidential campaign was just underway, that Ronald Reagan was the beast. Count the numbers in his name. Ronald, 6, Wilson, 6, Reagan, 6. He was convinced.
Well, there are many people convinced as well, with other figures in mind, and there always have been from the time the book was written. Probably what John had in mind when he thought about the beast, a great red beast with 7 heads and crowns on its head, was the Roman Empire, which he detested because he was a Jewish refugee from the Jewish war against Rome. He hated Rome because Rome had crushed a revolution against the empire that had destroyed his people and completely demolished the center of the city of Jerusalem. So he's writing about war, and he was well aware of that.
This is what I find so fascinating about your book, your thesis, that this is an anti-Christian, but not Christian in today's sense of the Christian word, an anti-early Christian kind of polemic.
Well, what's really curious, Jesus wouldn't have called himself a Christian. His followers wouldn't either. Certainly Peter and Paul, they would have, they are Jews who had felt they had found the Messiah. And it's only when you have an enormous influx of Gentiles and non-Jews into the movement that it becomes a different kind of movement. And it follows much more the way Paul interpreted Jesus than the way even more traditionally minded Jews did. So John was a very traditionally minded person. And what obsessed him was the way that Rome had persecuted his people, the way Jesus had been crucified for sedition against Rome, Peter had been crucified, Paul had been beheaded, James, his brother, Jesus, his brother, had been lynched. And the empire was a very dangerous place for devout Jews and followers of Jesus in particular. But at the same time, that book has been read throughout the centuries because it's basically pictures a war of good against evil. And you can plug almost any conflict into that.
The imagery, as you alluded to a moment ago, is so broad in some ways that you can almost, as preachers have done for 2 millennia, have plugged in almost any kind of world events, world leaders, world situation, and figured these are the end times.
Yes, and that's interesting because readers who engage this book seriously always say, we are just on the cusp of the end time. They thought this in the 2nd century, Augustine in the 4th century, because the book is written to say, it's almost here. I mean, these are the signs, you can see them now, and the time is coming. And that's certainly what John must have felt when he wrote it.
Are we even sure who this John is?
I don't say we're sure. He says his name is John, and we call him John of Patmos because he was living on the island of Patmos off the coast of Turkey when he wrote it. And the tradition says, Christian tradition says he was a disciple of Jesus, the one who wrote the 4th gospel. But that tradition only came in after other people had said that the writer was a heretic and was a blasphemer and had written some totally worthless, crazy book. And so its defenders came back and said, no, it's the disciple of Jesus who wrote this book.
Thank goodness your task was made easier by the fact that this is the one and only revelation that there could possibly be, right?
Well, that's what our impression is, because it's the only one in the Bible of its kind, certainly the only one in the New Testament. But what really surprised me as I started to investigate this is that this is actually one of an outpouring of books of Revelation. It's not unique at all. We have other revelations written, one by a Jewish prophet, for example, just at the same time John is writing, and just in the same place, in what is now Turkey, written about the coming of the Messiah and the Day of Judgment. And although that author doesn't think that the revelation of Ezra is about Jesus of Nazareth.
How then do you, or how then do scholars, how do any people of faith sort out which is, quote-unquote, the authentic revelation? How do you sort out which is editorial cartoon of the day versus inspired word of God? How do you draw those lines? Well,
that is the toughest question, because some people think it's a kind of crazy book that doesn't have any ideas in it, and some people, suggest that the author was on some kind of weird chemicals. But actually, he's writing out of a very traditional prophetic literature, which sees the enemies of Israel in these very kinds of images, and writing in the hope and conviction that somehow, although the world looks dark and it looks like the forces of violence and evil have taken over the world, that somehow there'll be divine justice and it will prevail. How do we discriminate? Well, people will say, well, it's in the Bible, right? Now, how it got there is another question. And who put it there is another question. Because now we have many other texts, many other Revelation texts, which we didn't know about until they were published between 1945 and 2000. Revelation of Zostrianus, the Revelation of Peter, the Revelation of Paul, many others that we didn't know about before. And the question, when you start realizing how much early Christian literature there was, is, how do you decide what's authentic, what's valuable and genuine, and what isn't? I don't see any simple answer to that question.
There was no central committee somewhere that took a vote?
Yes, there was a central committee that took a vote, and they made their selection. But if you start questioning their selection, that's when you get into what they called in the ancient world discernment of spirits. How do you know that the spirit that inspires your dream is an angelic being or a demon?
After this short break, Elaine Pagels on what Revelation says about today's political situation.
Are you finding this interview engaging? Curious about the book we're discussing?
Simply click the link in our show notes or visit our website heardeverything.com to get your copy.
When you shop through our affiliate links, you're not only enjoying great content, but also supporting this podcast.
Thank you for your support.
Now back to my 2012 conversation with Elaine Pagels. Your book is so respectful to the people today who take all the things, all the symbols in Revelation and see in them the armies massing in China to invade Iran and all the dangers in the supermarket scanners, the stuff that a comedian might use for a punchline, but you're very respectful toward in this book.
Well, I guess that's because there was a time when I was an adolescent that I joined an evangelical church that was very serious about this book, and I have a sense of the intensity and the passion and the conviction that people like that share. I had to leave that group because it was far too confined. And people are saying they know exactly what it means and how it works, and nobody can ask questions because, there it is. I just couldn't live in that world, and I don't. So my work is about exploring this tradition in a much wider vein. But I do understand the passion about the power of religion, and I think that's what my book is about. It's understanding something about that.
When I first got your book, before I started reading it, I thought, oh my gosh, here she comes, this smug debunker who's going to destroy everything that we thought we knew and smirk at us while she's doing it. And it wasn't that way at all.
Well, I'm glad you didn't find it that way, because that certainly is not what I was doing. I'm trying to say, there's a lot we didn't know about the early Christian movement, and now that we know a lot more, let's think about what that means. Now, that doesn't have to mean that people of faith just abandon it by any means, but there's a way that a lot of American Christians think that thinking about it is going to destroy faith. That's just not the case. It's not the case with my students. It's not the case with most people who think about it. But it's about time we do think about religion, because look what it's doing to our society.
Well, even if it is, again, as some reviewers would call it, an editorial cartoon, in effect, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is not the inspired Word of God, does it?
Well, certainly not. And also, it struck me that the power of this book has to do with the emotions it arouses, the emotions of hope and fear. And both of them are really powerful. And people who engage this book seriously really get caught into the fear and the hope that this book expresses. And that, for me, says a lot about religion and how it works. I think it's less about what your ideas are and what you believe in some conceptual way, than how you feel, what you hope for and what you fear.
We all hope that someday our enemies will be vanquished, and if they're vanquished in a particularly spectacular and gruesome way, all the better.
Well, yes, but one thing that I think is helpful to think about now is that this book casts conflict into a sort of battle between the good and the evil, between the evildoers and the good doers. And we've heard this in our politics, we've heard this a lot. And I think when you look around the world today, it's also helpful to say there's another way to look at the human race besides the saved and the damned, the good and the evil, because that doesn't allow you to negotiate conflict at all. These other books of Revelation have a much more universal vision of the human race, and I think bringing some of that in to temper the way we look at or have traditionally looked at conflict is something we really may need to do now.
So when you told your friends and colleagues the last couple of years that you were working on this book, what kinds of reactions, what kind of raised eyebrows did you get? What kind of gasps? What kind of questions? What kind of snickers? I mean, what kind of reactions did you get?
All of those. And the fact is that this book arouses everything from ridicule to terror. And people will often tell stories about how they were children. One of my students said, when he was a child in a very devoutly Christian group, he was afraid every time his mother was out of the room that she'd been raptured. even though the rapture is not in the book of Revelation, by the way. It's read into it by American Christians from Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. But there are many ways it captures us, and I think that's important to understand.
There are some things in there. I mean, again, going back to the Hal Lindsey, late great Planet Earth days, I remember he somehow extrapolated that the Beatles represented the brass breastplates or something, but then you look at nuclear weapons, you look at the tension in Iraq and Iran, the cradle of civilization, Whore of Babylon. There's a lot of stuff that it's not too hard to connect the dots.
Well, it isn't. And, today, in the 21st century, we're worried about the Middle East. And this book is about the Middle East. This book is about the destruction of Jerusalem or threats to Israel, because it's written by somebody who was intensely concerned about that. And it is, and many people are worried about the chaotic and violent events of the world. So John's conviction that there's meaning somehow in all of this, these troubling and terrifying political events. He doesn't always say what the meaning is, but he doesn't have to say what it is. He just conveys his own sense that somehow there is meaning in it, and somehow there will be hope at the end of it. And I think that is a very compelling message to a lot of people.
I have to tell you, when I was a teenager and attending a very fundamentalist kind of no dancing and no beer kind of church, it frightened me that I didn't know what everything in the book of Revelation meant, because I was more or less told, if not explicitly, that if you have enough faith, you'll know. Well, I didn't know, and I thought, why don't I know exactly what this book means?
Well, probably you didn't know because it is so oblique and so open to so many interpretations. And I don't think John tells you, but I do think he conveys what people told you. It means something. It has a meaning, and there are times, and it is known to God. You may not know, but God knows what's going on, even if you don't. And that is also a reassuring message. I mean, what struck me is that if you took all your worst fears and you wrap them up into one enormous nightmare, I mean, fears about sickness and plague and violence and wild animals and nuclear weapons and torture and war, and you put them in this huge nightmare. This is what the book of Revelation says. When the worst you can imagine happens, then what? What you don't find is that there are bodies all over the floor. Well, there are some. But it says, no, suddenly there will be a new world. There'll be a new life. There'll be new hope. And I think that is something that all of us have fears, that we hope for. So I think this book is powerful in many ways.
You can get your copy of Revelations by Elaine Pagels by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. HeardEverything.com is where you can also find my 1994 conversation with Bible scholar Karen Armstrong.
It's very easy to make God into a personality like ourselves, writ large, with likes and dislikes similar to our own, and therefore make him endorse all our particular prejudices. So we can make God into a Republican or a Democrat or even a racist.
And my 1992 conversation with the Reverend Robert Schuller.
I think there's life after this life. I really believe that. The human being is the only animal that's been able to conceive of that fantastic, immense, infinite possibility. And incredible human creativity almost always is scientifically reality.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you find podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, he's one of the most successful Hollywood directors, producers, and he's also a pretty good actor. We'll revisit my 1995 conversation with the prolific Gary Marshall.
We live like everybody else. When my shows were 1, 2, and 3 in the ratings, I remember I told my wife, hey, why don't we? She says, I know, it's wonderful. Come help me take out the garbage.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.